Okay, I'm going to be providing an overview of how Mulesoft and Provar can integrate. Using this diagram as a guide, you'll see the many different ways that Provar can integrate with Mulesoft and the various systems that Mulesoft has connections with. The first example that we'll be illustrating is the concept of connecting to a database from Mulesoft and syncing that database info to Salesforce. So this would be the database to Salesforce integration. The way that this works in Provar is we'll have our database over here on the right-hand side, which syncs into Mulesoft, and then of course syncs the data from there to Salesforce. We of course has access directly to those database systems either through API connectors or direct SQL queries, and then we can also directly access the Salesforce orgs the data is residing on as well. So this gives us the capability to do the read before creation and the comparison read after the data has been synced. The second scenario involves API testing or directly reaching out to a Mulesoft API endpoint and validating the data. We can use this to create data on other systems or whatever that API is exposed through Mulesoft. We can connect to those through Provar. And lastly, perhaps the most simple in this case for Provar's perspective, is the capability to connect directly to any of your Salesforce orgs and perform a Salesforce to Salesforce validation on your Salesforce to Salesforce integration. It's a very common practice that you have two Salesforce orgs, you perform a migration using Mulesoft, and you want to validate that data. Provar can help you do that through our SQL query native support. This is a Dynamo database that we're going to be utilizing throughout the course of this demonstration. This database contains 4 rows of lead data that's going to be synced into Salesforce. And these are Mulesoft applications that we're going to be working with. The first application is that database to Salesforce integration that we were discussing. Then we have our DynamoDB integration. So this is interacting directly with the Dynamo database using API calls. Then we have our 2 Salesforce orgs to handle that migration from one org to the other. This is our Salesforce org that we're going to be operating in for the most part. You'll see currently we don't have any leads showing up in this existing view. Now, if we look in Provar, we have a couple of different things that we have set up to work with Mulesoft. If we go into our settings, we'll see where we have all of our various connections for our different systems that we're testing. In this case, we have 2 different web service connections. One is for that Dynamo database that we're interacting with to sync the data from the AWS Dynamo database to Salesforce. So this is actually going to sync the leads in those tables. And then we have our Mulesoft API, which is our Dynamo database integration application. So this is going to allow us to create, read, update, and delete leads inside of that database in Dynamo. This is obfuscated using an API, so we're able to interact directly with it here inside of Provar. And then we have our various different Salesforce connections that we've created. Any of these connections can be created in the settings tab. If I add a new settings connection here, we can select Salesforce connection, and then we can create a normal Salesforce connection, and then we can configure the authentication however we want, using username and password, OAuth, or log on as if we're utilizing an admin connection. We've done the same for a couple of other different orgs here, so we have a number of orgs to play with, but all of those have been created in the same way. For our API testing, we have a generic web service connection, and then you can create a REST or a SOAP connection. From there, you only need to configure the authentication type and the URL for those connections. For the time being, these URLs are not locked behind any authentication, just for demo purposes. So let's look at our first example where we're verifying the database to Salesforce integration. I'll go ahead and open up my test case here and see how we've constructed it. Essentially, we have our Salesforce connection, which is going to be launching into our Salesforce org, and then we have our different connections for interfacing with Mulesoft. We'll go ahead and launch Test Builder to take a look at this test case. We've also set a couple of breakpoints in this test so we can discuss what's happening. It'll pause at certain points in the execution. So we have all of our connections established initially. Again, connecting to Salesforce, connecting to our Mulesoft endpoints. And now we're going to be querying those Mulesoft leads just to verify that they're there. And also it's going to verify that those leads are there at the end of this test case, once the sync has happened. So this web request to the Mulesoft API will query the leads and then assert that those leads have been received here. So we'll go ahead and just step forward a couple of times because this will happen in the back end. But then we can take a look at it inside of Provar to see what's actually happened. So if we look at our variables here, we can see in our Mule response, we have 4 items. These are all the leads that have been pulled in from that Dynamo database. And our assertions have passed here, so everything looks good. The next thing is going to be actually creating those leads or syncing from the database into Salesforce. Go ahead and look at our leads tab, and currently we see that it's empty. We'll perform the sync, and then we have a sleep here that's basically just going to wait for a second, and then we should see those leads populate. Now this has all been synced from that Dynamo database using that Mulesoft API endpoint. So then we can go in and verify each of these leads either through the UI directly in here using Test Builder, or as we've done it here in the back end. So I'll just resume it through where it's going to be performing SQL queries for each row that we pulled in from the Mulesoft response and comparing it to what we expect it to be, and then deleting that row at the end. So we'll see we now have 3. Basically just doing a little bit of data cleanup along the way, using our inbuilt delete object step inside of Provar. So we'll see all 4 of those leads have now been deleted. So we've verified that the sync is working properly. We've compared all of the data line by line, and we've got rid of our test data at the end. The next example that we'll show is verifying a Salesforce to Salesforce integration. So if we go ahead and launch this here, in this example, we first have a read from our test data to validate all of the sync is happening properly from one Salesforce org to another. So this is actually happening automatically for us. So basically, as soon as a case record is created, we have a listener that's waiting for that to happen. And then as soon as that record gets created in Playground 1, it'll sync the process, the cases, into Playground 2. So what we will see is that there should be a case with the exact same subject in both orgs. So if we go to our second org here, we can go to our cases. And if we go to My Cases, we should be able to see that there's a check Mulesoft integration that was just created a minute ago. We can see that here. Now, if we go to our other org, we should go into cases and see the exact same subject case is there as well. So that integration is working properly. Now we just have a wait here to make sure that this is occurring in real time. So I'll go ahead and step through. Basically, we're just going to be performing a SQL query to look for that case by the subject line. If we're querying it, returning the row. And we're only syncing a single case, so it only loops one time. And then we have a read here, basically just to clean up the records at the end. So if we go ahead and resume, we'll see it delete those case records that were created, because now that the integration has been validated, we no longer need those cases to exist. So again, just doing some data cleanup after the Salesforce to Salesforce integration has been validated. Now our last scenario here will be showing how we can verify an end-to-end integration inside of Provar. This end-to-end integration involves interacting with Salesforce, our Mulesoft API, and our Dynamo database. So utilizing all of our different connection types to showcase how we can do an end-to-end scenario. Now, firstly here, it's just going to set up all of our connections for usage throughout the test. Then what we're going to do is break this down into different sections. So firstly, we're going to look at creating a lead and verifying that that lead has been synced into Salesforce once we call the Mulesoft endpoint. So we'll set up some test data, and then we'll do a create lead here, which is going to be a Mulesoft API call. So if we go into our leads and do a quick refresh, right now we won't see anything there. So currently this is just creating the lead inside of the Dynamo database. It hasn't been synced yet into Salesforce. So we're just doing some basic assertions to make sure that that request header is appropriate and the response message is good. So the lead has been created in the Dynamo database. Then we have a sync to Salesforce API call that's going to occur. We'll validate this manually inside the UI. So there we have our sync. So it not only synced the newly created lead, because we only had 4 originally, but also the additional leads that were in that table. And then we're just going to do a basic assertion and then do a query to make sure that everything returns as expected. So basically, we're just mainly looking for that newly created lead to show up inside of our Salesforce org. We're searching it by name and then validating that that returns the record as expected. Next, we're going to query a lead and compare the data directly to Salesforce. So we have a get lead request. It's going to hit that Dynamo database. We're going to do a basic assertion there, and then we're going to compare the data that we've retrieved from our Salesforce query. So if we go ahead and back out here and look at what this is doing behind the scenes, we can see our web request, which gives us a Mule response. And this is the lead that's been queried here. So we can see it's broken down by the different fields. So we have company, first name, last name, and lead ID. And then we're going to just compare all this data to our lead rows, which has been pulled in from our SQL query in Salesforce. So we should basically just be checking the company names match, the first names match, the last names match, and we should be good to go. So we'll go ahead and resume this through, and all those assertions will quickly pass, and it has been validated. So the lead data all matches in Salesforce in the Dynamo database. This next step is going to be updating the lead and resyncing it into Salesforce. So currently what we have are 5 leads. At the end of this, we'll see some duplicates, but we should also see that updated lead. Basically, we're going to be updating, doing a Mulesoft update call. So if we go ahead and look at our Dynamo database here, we'll see we currently have these 5 leads, and we can look at the company first name and last name. Then if we go into Provar, what we'll see is we're actually going to be changing that lead that exists there. So once that update lead call has been made, we can go look at this and do a quick refresh. And we now see that that lead record has been updated directly inside of the Dynamo database. And we'll just do some basic assertions, once again, validating the response and the status. Then we'll do a query to retrieve a lead. We're going to do the sync to Salesforce. So if we do a quick refresh here, we'll now see that the leads have been resynced to Salesforce. And every time this sync process runs, it basically just takes all the leads that are in that database and pushes them into the Salesforce org. So you will see duplicates, but you'll also see the newly updated lead here as well. And again, we're just doing all of our assertions, mainly going to query on our expected newly created lead. So the one beginning with Rachel. Once that query has been complete, all the assertions should pass there as well. Now we have our last validation point for our end-to-end integration, which is going to be deleting something from the database and then showing it in Salesforce. So here we have a delete lead request that's going to come through. So if we go and look at our database here and do a quick refresh, we'll see we're back down to 4 leads in that table. So we've deleted that newly created lead. And if we go back into Provar, we're just going to be performing those assertions and then doing a query. So basically, we're just making sure that that lead is no longer returned whenever we query for it. So we're searching by ID. Then we're going to retrieve another lead. So this is going to be looking for that additional lead that was created. So neither of those should show up, so the assertions are passing. And then we're going to go ahead and go through and delete those leads from Salesforce by ID directly. So we'll now see that those leads have been removed from our Salesforce org as well. And then lastly, we have our cleanup process, which is going to go through each row of data here that we've created and just get rid of all of that test data so we can continue on. And now if we do a refresh here, we'll see that we have 0 leads in the org matching that status. So that was our end-to-end integration. So we showcased 3 different things here. We showed how we could do a database to Salesforce integration, our Salesforce to Salesforce integration, and then end-to-end integration involving API calls in Salesforce. So just to bring up our diagram once more to illustrate this, Provar has the capability to connect to all these different endpoints that Mulesoft can interface with using our native integration with Salesforce, our API connectors, and our database connections.